You are listening to Radiant Creators, a collaborative project composed of people whose passion, purpose, and dedication requires forging their own unique path of empowerment and livelihood. A Radiant Creator isn't making a living, they are living.
Today on Radiant Creators, we have Ben Davidson from suspiciousobservers.org. And there's three things I wanted to cover today while we've got Ben. One is Suspicious Observers, daily space weather news, what his site is about, the data that he's putting out every day. Part two, the 12,000-year Earth cycles, the cataclysms that tend to roll along. And then lastly, the grand solar minimum. That's definitely an interesting topic right now, and it does follow cycles that we've been seeing. So there's a lot going on with our sun. So good morning, Ben. Thank you so much for being on. And tell us about your journey. How did it come that you created suspiciousobservers.org and you put out so much data every day with the space weather?
Well, to be honest, everything really stems from the YouTube channel by the same name, Suspicious Observers. It started off as I had been classically trained in economics, statistics, and I got a law degree. And then I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer, and so I was working as a due diligence analyst, which forces you to use economics, statistics, your legal background, and then whatever the heck it is you are investing in for, whatever it is you're doing your diligence for. So pretty much right away what my bosses describe as portfolio diversification appears to their researchers to be a lack of focus, which causes them to master a new topic every couple of weeks or so. And so when they wanted to switch from mining operations to technology, then to biological investments, and then to a completely different technology. It really reminded me of my love of science that I had lost many years ago. And I realized that basically I've been trained to be an expert interdisciplinary researcher. And that's what I decided to make a YouTube channel about, except I was going to research the things that interested me rather than what was going to make my very, very rich bosses even richer. And one day I looked down, there were 100,000 people watching. I decided I was just going to dive in head first. We've got about 400,000 people watching now, and it's really just about watching all of the different things that are happening that we can keep an eye on, and then seeing the patterns that just naturally start to pop out to almost anyone. I do like to sort of help point them out whenever they're there, but most people can see what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and it's been a very fun journey that we all have taken together. That's a very accurate way to describe it. And you mentioned suspiciousobservers.org. We've got 6 websites right now. We do an app, we've got books, an annual conference, and it really all is a community endeavor. And it's a whole heck of a lot of fun, that's for sure.
I like the way you put that, a very fun journey. And it seems like you followed your excitement, you followed your interest, you did what was interesting to you rather than the boring drudgery of what would have made a living. And you took some chances and you made it happen. So do you find that when you follow your excitement, when a person just follows their interests, like as Joseph Campbell put it, follow your bliss, that life just works out for them? Do you trust in it?
I trust in it a lot more than I trust the other option, that's for sure. I know that I can't even ever imagine being in a cubicle or, something like that where you can't speak your mind, or you have to, even worse, speak someone else's mind. And it really is a freeing aspect. There's certainly something very, much more difficult to trying to create something and trying to go out on your own, as opposed to going to a stable job with health insurance and a weekly paycheck that's guaranteed to be the same thing every time. It's not without its different challenges, but I think I prefer it this way.
Yeah, it does seem that making your own way is always better, because to put your, basically to wipe the sweat off your brow and create something, it's always better creating that outcome and that wealth for yourself. Always better. Well, so as a due diligence engineer and with some of your background, it seems that people who, like I'm a day trader. That's how I make money right now. And I worked in IT for 23 years before that. And so charts and graphs and getting hooks into things and measuring them is just second nature to me. Do you find that people who have worked with charts and graphs, that have worked with data, tend to take to this material easier than people who have not? Because once you're acquainted with getting hooks into things and measuring and creating charts and graphs, then you look at the sun cycles and it just makes sense. You go, well, how do you argue with that?
Right. Well, if you take something that generally the community is not in enormous favor of, which is the blame of humans to the tune of 93% of climate change, and that's something that a lot of members of the community don't agree with. But they've got all the nice charts and hooks and all. They've got all of these things as well. That's part of it. People who can understand data and charts, but there's also and I don't know what it is about some people that makes them have an open mind to some things, or makes them willing to just hear somebody out, versus so many people that won't. I can't exactly put my finger on what it is, because I do see it across the board. I see it with professors, both sides. I see it with people who work everyday blue-collar jobs, both sides. And it's something very strange. But for the people who do know graphs and who do have that open mind, some of these things are very, very easy to comprehend. So the data on the sun and the weather, or the data on the sun on the earthquakes, very, very easy to see. The cosmology and the fact that we have a pretty good argument that there's no magical, mysterious dark matter particle, that it's just dust and plasma that we can't see, and the associated electric and magnetic fields with them. That becomes a little harder, because the data does definitively say that there's some kind of huge attracting force that appears to be just about everywhere, and yet we can't see any mass responsible for it. Of course, we are still fine-tuning and discovering that we are seeing dust in different wavelengths and finding plasma out further from galaxies than we thought we were going to. And so that kind of argument, where some of it is circumstantial, where a lot of the arguments in favor is, look, they have looked everywhere for this. Everywhere they said was possible. One group started at the high end, one group started at the low end, and they met in the middle, still didn't find anything in terms of the mass and interaction range that they thought they were going to look for. So they turned around and they jumped back to where, the very outskirts of what they thought was possible before. And now they're moving in the opposite direction, higher and lower. So things like that we consider prima facie evidence, but somebody who goes on numbers and statistics really doesn't see it that way. It's really just sort of the next logical step. And so I guess it might depend on which topic you're talking about.
That makes sense. Well, I think that one thing that might be that element that allows a person to see a broader perspective, or at least entertain it, put it in their neutral file, and just see if in time it comes to be truth or falsehood and gets tossed out. To me, it's just the getting of wisdom. Some people are interested in self-exploration. They realize that they're not perfect, that they've been wrong. Everyone's been completely wrong in their life and changed their mind, I hope. And that's what that might be the key, is just wisdom. I think that's a big part of it. So Suspicious Observers on YouTube, huge channel. It's got over 400,000 subscribers. And every day you put out the space weather. you let us know what's happening with our sun. Can you tell us about that? What do you let us know daily? Because we really want to get people interested in tuning into this and understanding our sun.
Well, sure. So there are numerous direct and indirect effects, and while there's tons that we believe we see as patterns and others we speculate, in these morning shows we tend to keep it to just the ones that are proven or peer-reviewed, or that we have actually gone ahead and tested. So, for example, things like earthquakes, we made a whole website about it, quakewatch.net, and so we do follow that now in terms of the science. But essentially what I'm talking about by that is we check for the solar wind, which is a constant energetic ion emission and electron emission from the sun, mostly just charged protons and electrons. And it goes out in all directions, and this happens 24 hours a day at all times. And its variations have different electrical and electrodynamic effects on our planet. Sometimes it gets strongly intensified by solar flares, which come from sunspots, or by coronal holes, which actually stream much, much faster solar wind, because the sun's magnetic fields actually leave the sun right there and stream all the way out past Pluto. So these are very, very powerful magnetic fields. And so the interaction of those magnetic fields, those particle emissions, the protons, the electrons in the solar wind, things like that, and also the level of light energy in the UV and the X-ray, how those things directly affect the atmosphere, something called the global electric circuit. It's not just lightning. Lightning's just the part we really tend to see. It actually goes from the top of the sky and couples down to different cloud layers, the ground, and sometimes even the mantle. And these energies affect technology. They affect human health. And in the cases where they are coupling to cloud layers, they're affecting precipitations and storms. And through cloud cover, they're affecting temperature. They also affect temperature through the coupling at the ground layer, exactly how much heat is delivered directly to the ground. It's not just ultraviolet light, but the electric current running through it as well. And when it gets to the ground and when it gets deeper than the ground, we also have to talk about earthquakes, because we've got water, iron, crystals, olivine, all kinds of things that are not only conductive, but they move when electric current is applied to them. And when we talk about the global electric circuit, we're talking about cells up and down, currents up and down that span literally thousands of miles wide, if not longer. And these can have drastic effects. I mean, these can cover an entire fault line or an entire fault zone. So those are the kinds of things we keep track on. What is the sun doing? How is it likely to affect our technology, our health, our weather, the earthquakes? Right now we are in a period where the sun's effect on technology is minimalized. It's an 11-year cycle, and half the cycle we're strong, half the cycle we're not. We are in the weak cycle for the sun in terms of technological effects. But there are certainly health effects that come with either an ultra-high solar activity state or an ultra-low solar activity state. We are witnessing a number of the low activity events going on. In fact, our app has had to send out a number of cosmic ray health alerts due to the sun's low activity, which allows energy from the rest of the galaxy and beyond to actually get into the inner solar system. When it's got really high activity and it's blasting hard, it's got its own magnetic field that blocks most of that stuff out. And so we're really talking about how the sun affects a vast amount of things in our daily lives directly, and then also how a lot of this is being resisted or blatantly covered up as truth for economic, political, and other reasons.
It definitely is. And Ben has put out a lot of info, talking about many things just now, and I definitely want to direct people to the Suspicious Observers YouTube, where Ben has some playlists, and one of them is Learn About Space Weather with the Sun series. So some of the things that Ben has just talked about, you might want to know more, or you might be thinking, what is he talking about? He's got amazing playlists, and you will know exactly what he was talking about with some perusing and some listening. So you do have a amazing disaster prediction app that people can download. I have it. I have it on my phone. I get alerts. Can you tell us a little bit about this disaster prediction app? And hey, everybody, you should have it on your phone.
Right. So right now it is, we are actually transitioning for a major upgrade here in the next couple of weeks to add a lot more space weather information. Right now it is mostly geared at monitoring the sun and monitoring the official data feeds and then communicating whenever there's a major solar flare or a geomagnetic storm or a significant earthquake, or whenever there's a reason that, whenever the cosmic rays are acting in such a way that we have seen statistically results in things like the highest number of stroke reports, heart attack reports, overall ambulance calls, emergency room to inpatient hospital admissions, things like that. And so we're transitioning to be able to actually have a lot of that data and a lot of the charts visible on the app, as opposed to it just being about the notifications thus far, which really are some of the more important ones. And also, of course, Earth is undergoing a magnetic event. Unfortunately, all the evidence points to a full magnetic reversal rather than an excursion. And we do have ways to see if the Earth's magnetic field is in the process of failure. And we would be notifying, God forbid that ever happens.
Yeah, that would be a big one, and we're definitely going to touch on that because, well, it's an important thing. Before that, though, I wanted to get into cosmic rays briefly, because I believe cosmic rays, of course, they come from our sun, but they also come from other suns, and they are traveling through the Earth, and the weaker our magnetosphere, the easier they get to us, and that's not always so good. I wonder what your take on cosmic rays are, as far as where do they come from, but then also how do they affect us and the Earth?
Sure. Well, there are actually three sources of cosmic rays. And a cosmic ray is defined as an ionized particle that is of super high energies, near relativistic energy. And so this would not be the normal solar wind. It's going very quickly, about 300 to 400 kilometers every second through space. But still, we're talking about a fraction of the speed of light there. The sun, when it puts out major solar flares, accelerates protons to those speeds. And so whenever we get a major solar flare, we do get cosmic rays from the sun. Whenever those bursts hit the Earth and the magnetic field gets compressed on the sun-facing side, that's a lot of electrons that were there to begin with, and now they're being compressed into a smaller and smaller space. They begin getting ultra excited and they begin shooting down through the atmosphere. This happens when the Van Allen belts get pushed down too far. And those electrons are at ultra-relativistic energies as well. But the vast majority come from the rest of the galaxy or beyond. The birth of stars, the death of stars, supernova events, any major thing you could think of in the cosmos that blasts out particles, blasts them out in pretty much every direction. We just happen to be in the way of a lot of them. And these things can run the gamut from just a single proton to all the way up to the heaviest element you can think of, stripped of electrons down to a very, very charged ionic version of the element that's on the periodic table. Things like ionized carbon, ionized iron, ionized helium. These are very, very common to see. Ionized lithium, you normally see agglomerate together in meteorites, just like iridium and things like that. But you get the idea. These things come down through the atmosphere, and the highest energy ones actually make it all the way into the mantle, where they directly affect the mantle viscosity and can lead to explosive volcanic eruptions. But the majority of them that are not the highest of high energies, they hit particles in the atmosphere and then they cascade out. And when this happens, it basically ionizes the atmosphere such that water vapor and dust and other things cling to it and form clouds. The hail nucleation works the exact same way. And for the ones that actually make it down to the ground, there's a number of different effects. And so if we're talking about the electrons or the protons that make it down to the ground, these can affect the electrical processes in our heart or in our brain or in the potassium and calcium channels, the ion channels in our body. That basically it's how we transfer that electrical energy. It's how we transmit information, things like that. The neutrons can directly break DNA. And if we're talking about those highest energy ones that make it down to the mantle, if one of those happens to hit your DNA, that DNA gets shattered too. If you've ever heard of something in computer programming called a bit flip, where literally just for some reason one bit just goes wrong, like it just gets flipped the opposite of how it was written, how it was before, causing a cascading problem. Cosmic rays have been known to actually cause bit flips. A lot of the technological issues that we have seen have occurred during major cosmic ray bombardments from the major solar flares, which I was talking about a bit ago. Those ones seem to be extremely effective on human technology of the electrical nature. And I don't know why those ones seem to be more influential over the technology than, say, galactic cosmic rays. And, since we're talking, since it is the solar-driven one, the electrons that come from Earth's Van Allen belts would be involved as well. So I guess I should say the ones that come from the sun and Earth's own energetic belts around the planet, those ones have the most effect on the technology. The cosmic rays seem, from outside of our solar system, seem to have the most effect on human health and on the weather.
When it comes to cosmic rays, it is a bit scary when you think of them hitting your DNA and changing it. A bit flip. That's not too appealing. I've heard a lot of different takes on how the cosmic rays affect us. Along with what you're saying, David Dubine of Adapt 2030, he mentions that the increased cosmic rays have caused or could cause, he has a theory that they can cause evolutionary leaps.
Oh, yeah, that's actually it's actually not his theory. He's done some work covering the people who have talked about that theory. One of them is Robert Felix, for example, who actually wrote the book Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. A lot of the folks who have been looking at these apparent evolutionary leaps in time, who have been looking at astronomical causation for this, have looked at the idea that cosmic rays or a distant supernova, or maybe not so distant supernova, or a major super solar flare could have actually rapidly changed the DNA of the people. And in fact, David Dubine used to come on our podcast, actually, our weekly podcast a couple of years ago. And, I remember I think he was actually there when I was explaining exactly how that worked. It's not my discovery either. Like I said, people have been talking about this for quite some time. And it is one of the leading hypotheses, because it's not enough to just have an evolutionary choke point where very, very few species survive, because then you're still going to see just a limited number of species in the next age from what you saw before. But we don't just see that. We see completely new species, just different things that weren't there before. This was first noticed in the 1600s by Leibniz, and his explanation was God. And that really didn't. Nobody looked for any better scientific explanation for that until really it was Cuvier in the 1700s, and a couple of the other folks who were like, all right, we need to actually have an explanation for all of these different pieces of evidence here. And I would say starting around the 1800s, they started to realize that there was a major Earth catastrophe involved with it. And I would say by the end of the 1800s, people were well considering the possibility that there was cosmic energy changing DNA, in addition to there just being a choke point, the kind of slow crawl of evolution type thing.
And on Coast to Coast, you were on Coast to Coast AM, and you mentioned that cosmic rays or increased cosmic rays can cause brain fog. And I remember looking at an article over at Space Weather Archive, and it poses, can humans sense magnetic storms? And their research said yes. So as we go through a solar transition right now, even though the sun is, you might say, going to sleep, it's slowing down, and we'll get into that more. Have you noticed, are you getting feedback that people are feeling that brain fog, that people are noticed something doesn't feel right?
I haven't received as many of those. I don't encourage people to check those out. There is a major problem with self-placeboing. And the potential for that. 5G has the same problem. Space weather, 5G, very much like peanuts. Some people are going to be really, really sensitive. Some people are going to be a little sensitive. The vast majority of people are going to derive fat, fiber, and protein and calories from it. Essentially, there's one thing you can do. If you believe that these things are going to be affecting you, and you believe they're going to affect you negatively, there is a greater chance that they will. And this is all because the placebo effect is real. Here's something to think about. An atom bomb tells you how much actual energy is bound up in one little tiny piece of mass. Now, the human body destroys billion-dollar drug trials every year just by the placebo effect. Those are actual chemical mass, large molecules, complex molecules, and not just one of them, tons of them given, by the milligram or by the gram. And yet the brain waves of your thought are overruling the physics and chemistry inside of the system that it controls. And trust me, it can work the other way as well. If you're afraid of 5G, if you're afraid of space weather, okay, yeah, you got a reason to be. But also realize that the placebo effect means that you've got the most powerful harp you could imagine set between your ears. Just use it. Our hair on our body is antenna. Our DNA is a coiled helix. It is a transformer. It's going to do whatever you think it should do. If you know that you can take in any of this energy, just like you take in ultraviolet light and positively create vitamin D with it, just like you take in visible light into your skin and create melatonin with it, all you have to do is just know what I'm saying is a fact. You have to know what the placebo effect is, and then you have to get your head around how much energy it must take and how much power your brain's brain waves, the same kind of wave energy in the atom bomb, how much energy it took to overcome all those chemical mass, bound energies. Because there's a lot more bound energy in all those molecules than in just one atom bomb, And yet,
definitely.
Your brain, just your thoughts are overcoming this. And so, I don't remember where this question started, but
that's okay. The best stuff we ever do is when we're on tangents. It truly is. And along with what you're saying, I wanted to mention that DNA, in my opinion, is a transceiver, because I think of it as a radio. And when you look at how a radio works, you have to actually transmit the signal that you want to hear. And it seems like you're saying that really we can transmit whatever end result we want, or whatever situations in life we want, because we truly are phenomenally powerful, and we create what we transmit. So we're really not victims of anything.
We can be victims of our own fear, that's for sure.
And many people are. That is absolute. Well, let's go to part 2. 12,000 year Earth cataclysmic cycles, also known as pole reversal, magnetic pole reversal. And I really want to point people over to suspicious observers. And of course, there's a Learn About Space Weather, the Sun series, and the last part of that does talk about cosmic rays and how they affect us. And also, along with what we're about to go into now, the cataclysmic cycles on suspicious. I don't know why I can't say suspicious today. I have no idea. But suspicious observers. There is a playlist, Earth catastrophic cycle, or catastrophe cycle, and it's amazing. It'll be a few hours if you go and watch that. If you watch it before bed, it makes for great nightmares. But it's essential knowledge, and you're going to find it deep and intense. So let's touch on the 12K Earth cataclysm cycle and how far back do we know about this? Because now we know that it's happened many times. I believe every 12,000 years, all the way back to 72,000 years or so ago, we know that it's been happening.
Right, and probably long before that. There's a lot of strong evidence that there was a really terrible one about 115,000 years ago or so. Just the absolute worst thing you could imagine. Luckily, we haven't seen one like that since. I think that the one 72,000 years ago being so bad is the only reason we can even see that one back so far, because the one 60,000 years ago and the one 48,000 years ago, they really just don't show up super well. But we do see the periodicity. This is by far the most necessary and unpleasant topic that I cover. Because and it is necessary and unpleasant. The unpleasantness is pretty much obvious. The necessary portion is because we are pretty much due up for another one, whether you're looking at timelines, whether you're looking at activity of Earth's magnetic field, or whether you're looking at the activity of human beings on the planet. And this goes across historical evidence, historical accounts, religious texts, cosmological evidence, geophysical evidence. It all kind of points to the same thing. And it's amazing, just in the last decade, with the launch of a few new satellites and with the bringing together of different scientists who had worked independently throughout the years, there is now, literally just in the last few years, for the first time, all of the information available to begin to no longer speculate about this sort of thing and get some definitive answers about exactly what is happening and what is going to happen again not too long.
And we're definitely seeing that from magnetic pole wander, which I do believe is what causes the Earth to actually begin to tip over. Can we get into magnetic pole wander and how it has been changing in recent history? It's accelerating.
Sure. Well, this is one of the areas where there's certainty. There's certainty about a lot of the things right now, and the finish line is pretty darn certain. How tiny little things play out along the way, those are some open questions, admittedly. But essentially, Earth's magnetic poles are not fixed at the actual geographic north and south poles. In fact, they're supposed to meander around the Arctic and Antarctic circles, very, very slowly, like maybe once a decade. If you look over a decade's time, it'll move maybe 2 or 3 kilometers. About 150, 170 years ago, this started accelerating to 2 to 3 to 4 kilometers every year. And then by the 70s, it was going about 25 kilometers every year. And at this point, we're up to varying between 40 to 75 kilometers every year. And that's the North Magnetic Pole. Now, it seems to be racing so fast so that it can catch up to the South Pole, which is way out ahead of the race, moving more slowly, but it's already left Antarctica, and it is coming up into the southern Indian Ocean. North Pole is running across the Arctic from Canada towards Siberia, and if you can do that, in your head, you can picture where Siberia is and where the South Indian Ocean is. These two are actually on a collision course somewhere around the Bay of Bengal, right around Sumatra area, where all those planes were going down, Malaysia flight, whatever, where we were having all those major earthquakes over the last 15 or 16 years. I would say 2 or 3 of the top 5 earthquakes in the last decade and a half have hit that exact region. We've noticed buoy anomalies followed by, instead of explanations for the buoy anomalies being taken offline in that area. As I mentioned, we see planes disappearing in that area. It is just astride of the Dragon's Triangle, which is Asia's version of the Bermuda Triangle. And in addition to these crazy coincidences and the crazy motion in general, it shouldn't be moving this faster, and they shouldn't be racing towards one another on a collision course. The field strength is weakening as well, which is the real telltale sign that this is not just some weird excursion of the poles, but this is an actual reversal, because we don't see the weakening throughout history every time we get a magnetic excursion. It's just when we get these full reversals. And so this is one of the ways that we know that sure, none of us know for certain that the Earth won't get sick of doing this cycle over and over again. For all we know, as we are sitting here speaking, the Earth said, nope, I'm going to pump the brakes and go back to normal and pull the North Pole back up into the Arctic here, put the South Pole back in Antarctica. We don't know. That could be happening right now. I don't think it's happening. The math doesn't say it's happening. And I like to go with math and history, and it does tend to repeat itself. This is one of the more certain ways we know that this thing is happening right now. We are currently about 150 years into it, and if it happened tomorrow, it would be in 4th place in terms of the fastest reversals that we know about. We know of a 100-year one, a 90-year one, and an 80-year reversal that actually took place. So we are actually – we would not set the record for fastest reversal if we were to all of a sudden snap flip tomorrow, which kind of puts us in the danger zone, knowing that they can happen much faster than they've already happened, than we've already been enduring this one. But it is accelerating. We are probably down about 25 to 30% of the field, and we are losing another 5 to 10% every 5 to 10 years. You get down to about 40, 50%, things don't look anything like they do now. You have unfathomable cosmic ray cloud production. The sun will be seen far, far less. The lightning, the hail, the electricity actually churning the energy that's in the earth up in the storms will be phenomenal. The volcanoes, because of the actual increase in cosmic rays, the volcanoes are going to have much more explosive activity. The viscosity of the mantle is pretty much going to change starting right at its ceiling, right where the magma pool is down below, and it's going to cause surges upward in the upwellings that exist. It's really just a terrible situation. It is easily seen alongside numerous extinction events throughout history, and amazingly, this might not be the worst part of the event, because all the evidence suggests that the sun is involved in this as well, and that it's the sun that actually triggers the worst parts of this. I don't know where you want to go.
Oh, no. Well, as far as certainty, yeah, it's a tough one the more you study it, because it does look like a cataclysmic cycle of a magnetic pole shift is very, very possible. Because when you look at the cycles and you look at what we know in history, when you check out all the charts and graphs, you can see it's really as certain as winter follows summer as winter follows summer. This is just a broader and a longer season that the Earth goes through. One question I have is, you mentioned buoy anomalies. What exactly is that?
So if you go to National Data Buoy Center. They have literally every ocean buoy out there in existence right now, all linked up into a network. Anytime there's any kind of anomalous event, they report it. There's an undersea landslide, there's a major earthquake, there's a tsunami, there's a rogue wave. These things catch everything. Nothing gets by them. A boat doesn't pay attention to where it's supposed to be going, causes too big of a wake near one of the buoys, the event will show up. They'll delete it afterwards because they'll see that there was a ship there and they'll do the after checks, but it'll show up. All of a sudden, a couple of years ago, one buoy just showed an unbelievable drop in its total chain length. And since there was not a giant bowl being formed in the ocean, they went and they checked and the buoy was still visible there at the top of the water. This could only mean that the sea floor was coming up underneath it. Over the span of a couple weeks, the sea floor came up over 1,000 feet, and then they turned the buoy off, and a day later, they even removed it from its existence. They actually took it off of showing there. And so if a buoy is active, they'll show it as yellow. If it's inactive or turned off for some reason, it shows as red. Well, one day it showed up as red, and then the next day it just disappeared. They never take one off. They've got ones that have been red on there for years, probably abandoned. They've got ones that, they show up as red when a hurricane passes by. A couple days later, they're back to yellow and producing. Never seen them actually take one off before. And it's the exact position I'm talking about where these poles are going. The exact place where we had the Christmas tsunami that killed 200,000 people in 2004. There was an 8.7 earthquake there on the same day as an 8.2 back on April 11th, 2012. It's the only day that there are to be known 2 magnitude 8 earthquakes on the same day. And they hit the exact same location, right where we're talking about there. This is where the poles are set to meet. And like I said, it is directly astride of the Dragon's Triangle, which is the magnetic anomaly version of the Bermuda Triangle. And of course, the pole that is closest to it right now is the South Pole, which is actually the strongest magnetic point on the Earth. You take a look at the conjugate point, on the other side of the planet where, okay, if the poles are going to meet there, they both can't be there. One of them will stay and one will pop out the other side. The other side of the planet is Peru and Chile, where all the big earthquakes occur on the other side of the Pacific. It's just astride of the Bermuda Triangle and the South Atlantic anomaly, which would be the weakest part of Earth's magnetic field, opposite of the South Pole magnetic, which is the strongest on the other side. So there's literally every coincidence you could possibly imagine, every data point you could possibly imagine, points to the new poles being right around Sumatra and Peru, being the new poles of the planet. Now,
and when that truly takes place, when that truly happens, that's when the Earth would rock over on its axis, basically.
Well, it would just be the crust. It would not be the whole Earth. I don't think the core, the mantle, anything else like that has ever changed. The only reason this actually sounds like lunacy right now to anybody is because of an intentional CIA cover-up of this. And I'm going to explain this right here. So literally just 70 years ago, the concept that Earth tilted over was not considered lunacy. In fact, one of the best geophysicists that allegedly the world has ever known, and Albert Einstein were working on a book together that ended up taking 11 years to finish, probably because Einstein died 9 years through it, and they only ever used his foreword for the book. But it was blatantly obvious that something caused incredible surge deposits. The oceans left their beds. Cultures would see the sun standing still for hours on end. Other cultures would wonder when the sun was finally going to rise and if the night would ever end. Whether you're talking about the stories from people or the evidence of these actual events happening, it wasn't questioned. It was really just like, how does this happen? Einstein and this other guy weren't looking to figure out if the Earth turned over. They just presumed it turned over, as did everybody else before it was covered up intentionally. I'll come back to that in a second. They just presumed that it happened, and Einstein's idea was, well, hey, look, if somehow you could disrupt this lock that the crust and the mantle have on one another. He wasn't sure why they had it in the first place, why this floating crust doesn't act like it's floating on liquid, why it literally acts like it's locked, attached to it. We know now that it's a thermoelectric equilibrium. But he said if you could somehow disrupt that, there was enough ice mass in Greenland to pull the entire crust sideways such that Greenland would be at the equator. I mean, that was what the world of geology was going on. Now, this ended up being called Earth crust displacement theory. And the actual theory came out by Charles Hapgood a few years after Einstein died. Like I said, he only used Einstein's foreword. And something tells me that the version he put out is not the version Einstein was on board with. Now, here's what happened when he put it out. It became the torch for this catastrophe in all of geophysical science because of who Hapgood was and because of who Einstein was. And everybody knew that Einstein was working on this with him. It was one of Einstein's self-stated great final projects of his life that he was working on intermittently, among other things, of course. But so this became the torch. And when it bombed, it took the entire concept with it because of how it chose to present the idea. Now, who is Charles Hapgood? Well, Charles Hapgood, most people know as one of the greatest geophysics professors in American history. He taught at a number of universities in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. But during World War II, he was one of the liaisons for the war group and the White House. And he was one of the founding members of the Office of Strategic Affairs, which some might know was the first name of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was one of the founders. Now, that's some circumstantial weirdness, but it doesn't really tell you anything. Okay, so he was a CIA guy, and at the same time he was a professor. That's not unthinkable, that a professor would also work for the CIA. And okay, so maybe he got Earth's catastrophe wrong. Maybe he and Einstein were just wrong. Well, there's this other book called Earth in Peril, and it is written by Ken White, the son of Major Maynard E. White. And if anybody has ever listened to their father's or grandfather's war stories, when reading this book, you can tell that he's telling the truth of what he heard, and his father was telling the truth to him about what he heard and what he saw and what he did. Major Maynard E. White led Project Nanook, the first military mission to the Arctic, to basically try to see if it was navigable and to watch for Russia coming over the top. And while they were there, they had a bunch of scientists who went on this trek because they wanted to figure out exactly where the magnetic North Pole was. They were telling the Major, we cannot give you all of the accurate navigational info until we actually find this thing. And they did, and they were able to work through all of that. But during their excursion, they found layer after layer of surge deposit, which is basically fossils, plants, basically a layer of death, which showed also signs of great geologic upheaval. Now, Major Maynard E. White and his geophysical scientists there went back to the Pentagon and the CIA in the 40s, by the way, late 40s, and were reporting to them. And I guess back then it would have been the Office of Strategic Affairs, not the CIA. But I'm just going to call it the CIA because I don't want to keep switching back and forth. It's the same thing. And he reported that they had found 9 layers of these catastrophes. And so He got a lot more help when he went back up to the Arctic to continue Project Nanook. And on the next briefing, when he was down at the Pentagon and with the Office of Strategic Affairs and the CIA, the geophysicist told him that's not 9 layers of catastrophe. That's actually just 5. One of them was so catastrophic it thrust the other ones up on top of ones there, and it just looked like there were 9 there. But actually, you just missed how bad one of them was. And so, here's the thing: the number one geophysicist at the Office of Strategic Affairs, the government, the Pentagon, was Charles Hapgood at that time. And here's what else he said. He said, what is happening is the magnetic field of Earth pulls down to the equator and then tilts the Earth. And then it snaps back right into place. And this happens putting the same places back and forth, basically ping-ponging 90 degrees, tilting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over time. Now, that's critically important. And he also gave the 12,000-year cycle reference. So, we can essentially presume that Major White took all this evidence up there, and Charles Hapgood led the charge to say this happens every 12,000 years. These are catastrophic tilts, 90 degrees back and forth to the same places. And that's important because it puts the polar ice caps in the same place over and over and over and over again, such that you can look over millions and millions of years and get tricked into thinking the poles have never moved. Because there is evidence of them having been there time and time again throughout time. And you can get easily tricked into realizing that it shifts periodically and then shifts right back. But so the version that Hapgood ends up putting out, again, after Einstein died, so we don't know what Einstein truly believed. But the version Hapgood puts out was that every 15 to 20,000 years, there is a 7-degree tilt on the planet Earth that takes 1,000 years. And by the way, what he had reported to Major White was that it happens in a day. And so we have this mutated version that Hapgood puts out, which isn't going to match the timeline, which uses a random 7-degree tilt over, a 26,000-year cycle or so to just explain away the catastrophe. And by the way, which does not tilt back to the same place every time. Literally, it doesn't match the geological evidence. It doesn't match the timing evidence. And it probably doesn't match what Einstein and he were talking about before Einstein died. But could it have been an intentional move? Was there a move to not let the truth actually come out about this? Because the version that Major White said he got from Hapgood, nobody knows that one unless they read that book or they work for the Rand Corporation, who also does the underground tunnels throughout the country, by the way. New York to L.A. in 21 minutes. Not that you can buy a ticket, by the way, or me.
Yeah, I've always been very curious about those tunnels. There's much speculation about them, and I guess some evidence, but it's hard to imagine them existing, but I believe that they do.
We're going to get to it here.
Okay.
If we have time.
No, we definitely do. I wanted to ask Charles Hapgood and Einstein, the book that they were writing together, is there a title for that? Was it actually published?
Oh, yeah. That's Earth Catastrophe Cycle. So
okay.
I don't know if you ever saw the movie 2012. They're actually talking about Charles Hapgood, and they mentioned in the movie Einstein did support it. He did a little more than support it. He wrote the foreword for the book, and he wanted to write the full thing. He just died. And it is a fact that he wasn't questioning whether or not there was a catastrophe cycle. He just wanted to know why it happened. What was the mechanism so we could try to figure out how to survive the next one. That's really where he was, and that's where all of geophysics was until Hapgood, basically being who he was and with the pseudo stamp of Einstein to boot, basically planted the flag in the ground and said, this is what catastrophe science is. And it was just a complete sham. Everything about it was wrong. The timelines are wrong. The crustal tilts are wrong. The sea level inundation is wrong. Literally, he put out something that could be easily debunked and take down the entire ship.
And that book was called Earth Catastrophe Cycles?
No, that was called Earth's Crust Displacement.
Okay, Earth's Crust Displacement. Okay.
Yeah, so that was his theory. Now, if that wasn't enough, the evidence is that Hapgood continued to work for Office of Strategic Affairs when it became the CIA, deep up into the 60s, and then probably at some time he stopped before he died. But there's evidence that so if there was something that was going to be classified or hidden by the CIA relating to the catastrophe in those years, chances are he also had a role to play in that as well. Now, the only thing we ever know of that was actually classified, because Hapgood and Einstein weren't the only ones writing about this. They were the final ones to sort of basically take over and write it, but they weren't the only ones doing it. And obviously people have been doing it since the 1600s, as I mentioned. But there's only one of these accounts that was ever classified, and it had to have been classified by Charles Hapgood. And this version, when it was finally declassified and heavily sanitized, part of what they sanitized and kept out, which was found actually at a university library, which they don't go into reference sections. That's a little too risky for a grown CIA agent, especially with all of the measures there now. And it is in one of the subsequent books that he wrote that this was covered up basically to hide the science and the event itself. So the fact that this happens and the fact that it's going to happen again is so powerful that you can't really have a cohesive modern society. What's your incentive to go take a bullet in the line of duty if you're a police officer? What's your incentive to go flip burgers at McDonald's? What's your incentive to process someone's taxes? What's your incentive to do anything? What's your incentive to follow the law? What's your incentive not to do a whole bunch of things? Now, granted, a lot of us have a good enough moral compass that that's all we'll need. There are so many people who are kept in line by fear of the consequences, it would shock you. And you take away the fear of those consequences or, belief in something imminently worse. And you will see just exactly what humans are. Animals. Just highly evolved animals. They took the magnetic field away from a number of rats and a number of mice. This is something in the classified work that we weren't allowed to see, that they literally had to go, one of my buddies had to go find it at a university library. One of the experiments, they took the magnetic field away from a bunch of mice. They all started eating each other. All the food they could want, all the water they could want, all the running wheels, all the tubes to run through, they just started eating each other.
That's amazing, and it's not surprising.
It's really not. It was basically a real world zombie apocalypse when they had a magnetic reversal in that little mouse thing there. In addition to wanting to hide this, they wanted to hide the implications of it, because how this is actually possible leads you to anti-gravity, free energy, super weapons. And not the kind of thing that would be controlled either. The kind of thing where somebody could just go Google how to build a device that would crack the world in half. I mean, I don't know. I know I don't want everybody I went to high school with knowing how to do that. So there's that.
No, it wouldn't be good. Well, you mentioned the mice and the zombies. Mice literally becoming a zombie apocalypse without you mentioned magnetic field. So do we have any links to that? Does that research exist? Is that available? Can we find it?
The only references to it are in that classified work.
Okay. Yeah,
there are people who have speculated that it's one of the reasons it was classified.
And that makes sense. Well, I do believe in people can take this however they want, but you look at it, things that are going to happen tend to show up in our intuition. And that'll lead me to the Adam and Eve story in a second. But zombies are so prevalent right now. There's movies about them, TV shows about them, and they're very, very popular. And people seem to be drawn to it. And so no magnetic field or a magnetic field weakening and humans losing their minds. Well, I don't know. It could just be our intuition picking up on the future. So that's a very interesting topic that you bring up. And I just wanted to make sure, the book with Charles Hapgood that had the foreword by Einstein, that was called Path of the Pole, I believe. He put out a couple of books. He's got a bunch.
Yeah. You certainly stumbled onto the correct list of books there. That's for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to note that.
I haven't studied his works as much because I know what he says happens, and I know that it was easily debunkable, and I know it sunk the entire ship. He took everything down with it, which might have been the idea, especially as this other one was getting classified, which actually makes sense now that we have all this data and the satellites, and we can look at all the different pieces that people have brought to the table and start to put them together. We can see that this one that was classified, it's interesting because what actually plays out on Earth in this guy's theatrical blockbuster-like version is just way, way overblown and no chance it's going to happen. But his trigger, even though he calls it the wrong thing, he uses a name that we don't use anymore scientifically because we realize that that's really not a good thing to call it. It's something slightly different. He got it right. He got it absolutely right. In addition to mentioning that thing about the zombies, in addition to mentioning the plasma universe magnetohydrodynamics, which is basically how the government does its UFO technology. It's how free energy works, how super weapons could work, all that stuff I just mentioned. But also, he actually got what is the only physically workable answer to how this happens time and time and time again like this.
I gotcha. Well, you mentioned the book World in Peril, and that's one that I've had on my reading list for a while, and I need to order that I need to go find a copy. It's not still, I think, actively being printed, but you mentioned how a person who was in the military would recognize it. They would recognize, okay, this is definitely written by somebody in the military. And that's always one of my litmus tests for books like that, because I was in the military when I was younger, and so I can recognize something written by someone who was in the military. It doesn't make them special per se. It just means that there's certain things they're going to note that are obvious that will lend to the efficacy of what's being written. There's another book along those lines, well, different topic, but it's called Day of Deceit, and it's an alternative version of Pearl Harbor. And when I read that, I went, this is long and boring and detailed, but man, it is authentic. I could tell somebody in the military had written that. So I look forward to finding World in Peril. And you've written a book, too, The Weatherman's Guide to the Sun. And tell us about that book. And we'll move on to some other things if you still have time. I'll let you get into the Adam and Eve theory and the Cataclysm cycles, break down the smaller versions that aren't just 12,000 years old, the smaller ones. Maybe touch on the grand solar minimum that many believe that we're moving into. But that would about wrap it up. But if you have the time, tell us about your book, Weatherman's Guide to the Sun, and let's touch on the Adam and Eve story and how accurate that might be.
Right. So the book Weatherman's Guide to the Sun is currently being used by 3 very brave professors. I believe what they're doing is a a wonderful thing for science, and so I tend not to throw them under the bus because I imagine they would get trolled. And we've seen what people do when they try to look at the sun and climate and weather. They can lose grants, lose jobs, and it's a really dangerous thing to try to do real science there. But essentially, it breaks down what is literally hundreds of correlations between different solar activity and cosmic ray activities, and different weather phenomenon, weather patterns, and climatological phenomenon at short and long scales as well. There's almost nothing about the weather and the climate that the sun doesn't play a role in, whether it's daily cloud cover, the temperature on the ground, El Nino, number of hurricanes, where the hurricanes go, number of tornadoes, how fast the wind is, lightning, hail. All of this is tied to energy from space, because a lot of it penetrates right down through, and that which doesn't penetrate, which gets caught up in the magnetic field and the ionic layers at the top of the atmosphere, gets funneled through that global electric circuit I mentioned directly down to the cloud layers and the surface and the mantle. And so that's basically what the book is about, what the mainstream science is discovering all over the world in all the different ways, but nobody has actually come and put it all together academically. Based on how academics works, we're about a decade to 2 decades away from that, and I didn't think that was necessary when I could just do it and write it in a way that people could understand it. And the initial textbook that official academia will put out will be for master's students and PhD students, but we've got middle school and high school kids that can understand this one. So very proud of that. Now, you want to talk about another book, The Adam and Eve Story?
Yeah, The Adam and Eve Story. I believe that was, originally written in 1973, and you talk about it in your Earth Catastrophe Cycle playlist on Suspicious Observer's YouTube channel, Essential Viewing. Everyone should check that out. But with The Adam and Eve Story, I believe that there's a whole version of it available online now. I found a link to it. It might be the real entire version, but let's talk about The Adam and Eve Story. And how accurate do you think that is as far as the magnetic pole reversal on the Earth?
So that is the version I was talking about that got classified, the one that's just too theatrical and blockbuster, and it's not going to happen. But a lesser version of it is going to happen, and that's the version where they actually got the right answer for why it happens. That book was actually originally written in the 50s or 60s. That's the one that Hapgood classified in 66. He wrote postludes and tried to self-publish them throughout the 70s, and his last one was actually 1993. But so that is actually the book that caught our attention and got us into this so much again, because we had sort of stopped talking about this after 2012, 2013, because there wasn't any new information. There was nowhere else to go with it. We knew that the magnetic field was changing, but we could do nothing but really sit back and watch. But then we find out that this version was for some reason classified when everybody was talking about it. Even somebody who co-founded the predecessor group of the CIA put out an opinion on this and says it happens. Why classify this one? Well, that's the book we're talking about here. And it was 1973 or so whenever the first version was ever written that had that information. There's no actual evidence that anybody had it before 1993. But essentially it talks about a magnetic null zone in the galaxy which triggers our solar system. And this is so close to the only plausible mechanism for a repeating solar system disaster. It's clear it's not just Earth. It looks like it happens to the other planets. We see the evidence. And the evidence in stories tend to blame the sun when this thing happens. They don't blame the galaxy. They don't blame Earth's magnetic field. They either blame God or they blame the sun. In many cases, one and the same thing. And so, how do you get this cyclical catastrophe triggered by the sun? But at the same time, has Earth showing signs of the change before the catastrophic event on the sun? It happens as an entire solar system moves through what that book describes as a magnetic null zone. And it's not that it's a magnetic null zone, it's that there's not a uniformity to the magnetic fields. And so here's how you have to think about it. Whether you can think of the solar system as like a disk with the planets orbiting close to the equator of the sun, or whether you think of the galaxy, the Milky Way, as a disk, basically orbiting close to the equator of the galaxy. Well, right at the exact equator, there's absolutely nothing of interest whatsoever. There's nothing magical about that line. However, rippling close to that equator, up and down across it in a very wavy fashion, is a highly electrified sheet. North of it are all the northern fields flowing one direction in the solar system or the galaxy. South of it, you have the magnetic fields flowing in the opposite direction uniformly in the solar system or the galaxy. The stable periods, the very long stable periods, are when we are embedded in one of those uniform field areas. As the sun, just like the Earth, gets hit by this rippling wave every 2 weeks, much faster than we go around the sun. And so it's not that Earth crosses something, it's this rippling sheet comes by and hits us. And so when this happens on Earth from the solar system, we can actually get a geomagnetic storm, auroras, electrical effects. And so you immediately scale that up to what's happening when the sun gets hit by the galactic version of this, which again would happen much more often than its 250 million year trek around, maybe as often as every 12,000 years. But what's going to happen as this engulfs the solar system is these uniform fields begin to become less uniform in one direction. They become all jumbled and bungled up because on the other side of this thin sheet, they're going to be going the opposite way. It's this jumbling and bungling that sort of leads them to be pointing the other direction on the other side. And in the middle, as opposed to being, having that uniform magnetic field applied to you, you're in this chaotic magnetic area with much more dense electromagnetic material and tons and tons and tons of dust at the galactic level. Because there you're not talking about sparse ions that shoot around. You're talking about the product of supernova, which is dust. And it is attracted to that electric field, that chaotic electric field between those magnetic areas, just like dust in your home is attracted to a Swiffer duster. Same basic concept. Now, the reason this is important, we already know that when this happens to Earth from the sun's rippling sheet, we get a magnetic disruption here, an electromagnetic surge. That's going to happen to the sun when this galactic version hits it. But at the same time, all of that extra dust, which we are actually just now beginning to see with some of the longer wavelength infrared emissions and some of the Gaia surveys, again, we're just being able to see these faint sheets of dust now. And by the way, if you're inside of one, you actually can't see it because it just looks like dust everywhere you look. Looks like you're looking through a forest. But so the way that many of the non-cataclysmic supernova in the universe, and by the way, not all nova are the death of a star. In fact, some go boom again and again and again. They're called recurrent nova. You could Google that right now. The hypothesis is that they have a binary star that feeds material, dust, and gases down onto the surface, which agglomerate, heat up, insulate the energy, and reflect back and causing a cascading energy rise till it busts off the shell in a minor nova event. Well, the same thing can happen. You put too much dust in the solar system, and Unfortunately, it does look like we are talking about something more like a solar micronova than we are a major flare, because this dust element is present too, and it has to be. If it's just a super flare, there's nothing but heating. But at the end of this process comes an ice age. The end of this process is the new ice age. And so you have to somehow have unbelievable cold. And the only way you do that is after the major burst. There's dust everywhere blocking the sun. There's dust in our atmosphere blocking the sun. Not to mention what was produced extra by the actual micronova itself. And so there's a number of things that we have to look at. And so we can't ignore that the sun is involved and it's a cycle. Well, how do you get there? You have to start looking at the galactic level and what happens there. And you use the Earth going around the sun as your laboratory to scale up to the galaxy and what's going to happen with the sun. You take a look at the fact that, okay, we have this magnetic event, we have these mass extinctions and an ice age all happening at once, and you realize it has to be something more than a super flare. There's got to be the dust component too. Now, your one way around that is if the ice age isn't everywhere, it's just at the new polar regions. Not sure there's evidence for that, but that would be one of the ways that we don't have certainty. We know that some places at the end of this event will see, 1,000 feet of snow in 40 days. We know it's going to happen in some places. But what we don't know is whether or not it was a micronova that injected the heat, evaporated the water, and then the dust cooled the planet such that it fell as snow, or if it was something like a super flare that gave the final electric field burst to unlock the crust in the mantle. And then it's not that the whole planet freezes, it's just where those new polar regions are. It's an excellent question. No, not to mention the fact that this will unleash many, many, many volcanoes, simply because of tilting alone, any kind of disruption of the plates as they start to knock together, that's going to cause major volcanic eruptions. Not to mention that the blast itself will be wholly cosmic rays. The first part that hits us, it's all cosmic rays, which are going to trigger those explosive eruptions, which further throws the planet into that cool period, the ice age due to the volcanic aerosols.
Yeah, it definitely is worthwhile reading, even though we know a bit more now than he knew at the time. Chan Thomas, who wrote the Adam and Eve story, he definitely has an amazing take on Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Did a lot of research along those lines, how they're actually the history of pole reversals, and at the end he talks about if we evolve fast enough between them, we just take off and leave the planet. At the end he mentions that. So it is very scientific, but it's also very eclectic. It's definitely mind-expanding reading, and something he touched upon in the book was that Eve knew. So your intuition will tell you of these things to come. Maybe we'll touch upon that again. But he does mention Monument Valley, and I'm here in Arizona, and ever since I read the Adam and Eve story, I've wanted to get to Monument Valley to actually see the geology that he speaks of, that the earth changes would have made, that you can see in Monument Valley. So now there's the Cataclysm events that tend to happen about every 12,000 years. And have you ever looked at Gobekli Tepe that Graham Hancock made fairly famous recently with some of his books, like Fingerprints of the Gods, and his new one coming out, America Before, The Key to Earth's Lost Civilization. I mean, his take on why we've had cataclysms is a little bit different than the sun, but yet he does document those cataclysms very well. And on on Gobekli Tepe, he finds, looking at the writing that we can find there in pictographs, that they spoke of a cataclysm, and it looks like it was created about 12,900 to 13,000 years ago.
Right. Well, that was actually Robert Schoch and the people who actually discovered Gobekli Tepe. He's the one, Graham Hancock is the one who is willing to say the exciting and shocking stuff and write the books and do those videos about it and stuff like that. When it comes to the catastrophe, I know he thinks it's pretty much all impactors.
Yes.
Unfortunately, you're ignoring a ton of evidence, not to mention the fact that if a micronova occurs on the planet, it's going to blast all the asteroids between us and the sun right at us, not to mention that the shell itself will constitute asteroids. And so all of the evidence from our ancestors, which points to the sun, conflicts with Hancock's work, and even some of the higher element abundances could not have come from meteorite impacts. They had to have been produced in either super solar flares or nova. But again, he's not a chemist or an astrophysicist, and he's done a phenomenal job showing that these things do happen, and they happen cyclically. He is, by the way, the only person who refused to participate in the Catastrophe Cycle series. I don't know if you know, I got Robert Schoch twice, August Dunning, Randall Carlson, even Paul Laviolette was willing to come on and discuss this galactic issue. Graham Hancock was the one guy who refused to return my emails for reasons unknown. But Gobekli Tepe, yeah, of course, that and what he says about Gobekli Tepe is not at all inaccurate, and it's pretty much in line with what a lot of the research from the archaeologists actually shows, that this thing was there. It was foretelling or describing a catastrophe, and the only thing I don't know about it is whether or not it was intentionally covered up. That does appear to be the intentionality of the covering up of Gobekli Tepe with sand is the weakest of all of the arguments. And if we're talking about a catastrophe, that's one way to get it covered up pretty darn well, which I think is just too much of a coincidence to just write off as a possibility.
I'm with you on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And so, with the 12,000 year catastrophe cycles, you mentioned on Coast to Coast AM that you thought it could definitely happen. Well, you thought there's a possibility of that happening within the next 30 years.
Right. The evidence for that comes in a number of ways. First, you look back in time and you can see that the last one was about 12,000 years ago. And then you look at the magnetic field of Earth, and at most, that thing's got 100 years left, probably closer to decades, and at worst case, the next couple of years. But the magnetic field is a pretty good gauge of this. And just like we can take a look back through history and know it's not 100 million years until the next one, we can look at the magnetic field and know it's not hundreds of years until this thing completes. This thing is on its way to its snap point now. If you take a look at some of the writings that come from the past, whether they are meant to be more historical accounts or whether they're meant to be, religious prophecies, a lot of them talk about the way humans are after the catastrophe, in the lead up to the next one, and then right before the sunlight does its disinfecting. The whole world is a Sodom and Gomorrah right now. It's not just Las Vegas. And that doesn't mean everybody, but you can go anywhere and be that kind of person if you want to be. Literally just about anywhere. Maybe there are some Mormon towns in Salt Lake City. You probably couldn't pull that off inside of Vatican City in Rome. But you get the idea. You can go anywhere in the world and be evil today. And it's not even shocking. We'll just shrug it off like it's normal.
Oh, we're normalizing pedophilia. Yes.
Yeah. So, and obviously it goes beyond that as well. But so literally, whether you want to look at it from people, you want to look at it from trying to time cycle to cycle, or you do what I do and you watch the magnetic field, and specifically in between their 5-year updates, which is actually you can't update the pole position any more often than every 5 years just because of its circular motion. But just by watching the magnetic field every 5 years with their updates, and then on much shorter time scales, based on how Earth's magnetic field is reacting to different space weather events, we can get a pretty good gauge on that as well. And I think that's our best timeline measure. And so, for example, in 2015, we started noticing that, the solar output was not really all of that exciting. It was putting out smaller events, maybe medium events, but nothing cataclysmic. And yet we were seeing the same type of effects on technology and on the energy levels in the atmosphere that we used to see with 10, 20, 50 times greater solar events. And so how do we know for a fact that the sun's energy it was putting out in these more recent events was lower, and yet we were seeing the same level effects on Earth? That lets us know that much more of the energy that the sun puts out is actually coming in and affecting us. And the only thing stopping it from doing so is Earth's magnetic field. It's our electromagnetic protective interface with energy from space. And as it weakens, we are seeing those greater and greater and greater effects. And unfortunately, it'll get to the point where energy from space has near complete control over the weather, the volcanoes, and the earthquakes. And sadly, that'll mean technology, which probably won't exist at that point, and our health will be a lot more tied to the energy around us. It'll be more important than ever that our diet is good, that we ground ourselves to the earth electrically, things like that, so charge doesn't accumulate inside of us, things like that.
And with the cataclysm cycles, they're every 12,000 years, but if we have time, I'd like to touch on the grand solar minimum that many believe that we're moving into. And so within those 12,000 year cycles, there's smaller cycles. And I believe the grand solar minimum is about every 400 to 600 years, where the sun definitely does stop creating a lot of sunspots. And you could say it gets cold, and that minimizes our magnetosphere. And we start to go into a bit of an ice age, or at least a cold period. So what are your takes on the grand solar minimum?
So this is actually one of the greatest misconceptions. It has nothing to do with Earth's magnetosphere. It has no long-term effect. It does not change Earth's magnetosphere one bit. This is one of the bad pieces of information that has come out over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, there's a lot of channels out there talking about grand solar minimum, and I will tell you right now, I'm not ashamed to say, I don't like any of them. They all got their starts with me. They all learned just enough to be dangerous. They didn't take responsibility. They don't read the papers. They hear something that is said, and then they blow it up to the most extreme thing possible. It definitely has nothing to do with Earth's magnetic field. It doesn't change it in that way at all. And we are also at least one solar cycle away from it being here. There was some very irresponsible reporting about how far into the process we were just over the last 12 to 14 months. And again, it came from those very few channels who saw that, hey, we know enough to be sensational now, and they decided to do it.
No, I like where you're coming from. That I hear you. It makes sense.
Essentially, we have this probably coming up this century. It looks like definitely not this coming cycle, but the cycle after that, there's a really good chance that could be the start of the grand minimum.
And the grand minimum would be, so you see it very differently than, well, some of the people who are talking about the grand solar minimum. And your take would be...
I'm very curious to know what you mean. And you have to excuse me. I actually have to go into a different part of the hall. I may sound a little different. My children just got home, and they're being loud, so I apologize if I sound slightly different. What do you mean I have a little different take on it?
Oh, no, actually, you have a very different take on it. No, I'd like to, let's clarify this a bit, because, right now there's many, YouTube channels that talk about the grand solar minimum. Yeah, go ahead.
I should not be afraid to do this.
Oh, definitely not. No, that's what we're about. I'd really like to know exactly what you're thinking along those lines, because for one thing, the grand solar minimum, people who are talking about that, regardless of its efficacy, it's bringing people into looking at the sun a lot more, and then ultimately also bringing them to your work. So let's see what's up.
I hear what you're saying, but that's really your level 101 wake-up stuff, when you can't tell the difference between whether or not climate change is a fraud and whether or not Nibiru is coming and hiding behind the sun. You know, that literally, when you literally can't tell the difference between those two things, that's where it's okay. But we're beyond that now. And we're beyond speculation. We're beyond somebody saying, oh, has grand minimum begun? No, it definitively has not. Oh, does this affect the Earth's magnetic field in this way and decrease it? There's zero evidence that it does that. No evidence exists for that whatsoever. There are a bunch of people that are making YouTube channels, and there's a couple of professors, including Professor Zarkova, who used to email me asking me questions about these things before she would publish her papers. And, you know, these people literally are giving bad information, and it took so long. I read thousands of papers. I got up every day, weekends, holidays, everything. I diligently did this to get some credibility for this. And in one fell swoop, these 4 or 5 idiots have turned this into a crap show again and turned it into complete lunacy. Whereas, you know, this was gaining traction in mainstream science, it's now taboo again because of these idiots. And yeah, they've brought some people to the table, but it's the same kind of people who won't think to use their harp, and they'd rather just be scared of 5G and say the government's trying to kill me. Those aren't exactly the most helpful people to have on board. It's the people who can actually do the critical thinking and see the bigger picture. The people who won't just take the years of research and diligent work of somebody else and realize, hey, I can spin this story a little scarier and get more clicks and things like that. It's not a matter of, their opinions differ. Their opinions are not based on any fact, and they shouldn't even be called opinions. It's bad information. Straight up. We are beyond speculation with so many of these things. And speculation is the vast majority of what so many of them do, mostly because they can't be bothered to actually sit down and read the papers. And yeah, I understand. If you have to start today, you're about 5,000 to 7,000 papers behind the people who really know what they're talking about. It'll take you a decade, like it took us a decade. These people were watching, they are asking questions for a couple weeks, maybe in one of their cases 2 years. And all of a sudden they're experts spouting this stuff, oftentimes not citing their work. It's been exceptionally frustrating. The people who many people on YouTube think should be my collaborators and best friends, they're the people who cause me the most pain and frustration online, believe it or not.
No, I get where you're coming from. And so, yeah, what you're seeing is the magnetic pole reversal in the future within 30 years or so, where they're seeing more of a grand solar minimum, which is just a lack of sunspots and then affecting road agriculture and cooling the earth some. Is there any relation in those two events as we move towards a magnetic pole reversal?
So I'm going to move back now because my kids are being extra loud again. Essentially, we are unlucky enough to be seeing both of these things happening around the same time. And it wouldn't shock me if it timed up such that the thousands and thousands and thousands of years cycle of Earth's magnetics timed up such that it only reversed during these grand solar minima. But that wouldn't shock me at all. But the last 10 grand solar minima, there has not been any kind of change like that. It has been the steady, much, much, much longer cycle. And the actual entry into a grand solar minimum doesn't have any effect on Earth's magnetic field. What I'm saying is we are so unlucky that they're both going to happen pretty much at the same time. And given what we know about cycles and cycles building to other cycles, chances are that they are timed to happen at that same time. But one isn't causing the other one by any stretch of the imagination. Not even close.
I gotcha, and that's great info. Definitely is. And let's see. Was gonna ask. There's something I really like that you said. You mentioned people going on about 5G is the government trying to kill us, and I like your take on that because 5G is something that people are thinking about a lot, and it's definitely all over YouTube. It's everywhere. 5G, they're going to kill us. Well, anyway, I have a bit of a background in RF and radio frequency, and one of the things that gets me about 5G is, well, for one thing, we're in charge of our DNA, and we can just, we don't need to let 5G affect us. We don't. We have that. I believe we have that power, but beyond that, radio frequency is really only dangerous depending on how close you are to the transceiver. So if you climb a radio tower, you might die burns all the way through your body a few hours later. But at the same time, if you walk past it beyond the fence, you're going to be fine. So it seems like 5G, it appears to be a very quick frequency and a very low power frequency because they need so many towers to broadcast it. So it seems like for the most part, I think it really has yet to be seen the effect it has on us because it's a quick frequency, but it's a very weak frequency. So it seems like it's not, I don't know if it would have any more effect than any other radio frequency going through us.
Now, so the studies that showed the cell phone tower damage, to people, they did extreme versions of that as well. And I apologize. I have had to move around again. I hope this is okay.
Totally fine. You sound good.
My kids are literally just keeping me on my toes right now running around this house. So many radio frequencies studies, it's exactly the same kind of thing. I actually don't think these are going to be as damaging as some of the microwave frequencies that are used out there, or other things like that. But you make a very good point that there's only so much you could do. I mean, like too much water, too much oxygen, you're dead. Put yourself at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and see how well you do. Or put yourself in an all-oxygen environment and see if your skills don't start see if your skin cells and all the cells of your body don't just start literally rusting apart at the seams. It's a matter of dosage, and how. I don't know if there's any healthy aspect to it. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I know that there's healthy frequencies and harmful frequencies. And if you find a healthy one or a harmful one, harmonic scale it up and down, and all of those ones are going to be helpful and harmful too. So I feel like there's reason to be concerned about a lot of these things. But like, for example, genetically modified food, pesticides, glyphosate, bad pharmaceuticals, these things concern me much more than 5G.
I like what you're saying with that, and it's one of the things that bothers me about a lot of the global warming crowd is that they've latched onto something which is, bullshit, and they are basically just grandstanding and cry-holing, and they want attention. Global warming, we should, down with the elite and all this nonsense. But the issue is, none of them are environmentalists. And I just feel like there's so many things an individual can do to impact the environment in a productive way and a sustaining way, and they don't do it. They just cry about global warming. It's like, well, do you have a compost pile? Do you recycle? Well, do you try not to buy crap in the first place? What do you eat? I mean, quite literally, are you taking so many pharmaceuticals that when you pee, you're poisoning the earth? I mean, there's so many things we can do, and people do not. They just cry about global warming, which they really don't want to do anything about. They just love the brawl. Well, as we wrap things up, magnetic pole reversal, it's heavy stuff. It would not be a pleasant experience for humanity at all. But humanity is tough and they're resourceful, and they will continue. They have in the past. And, you know, I've seen some war-torn countries when I was in the military, and I've always been amazed at how, no matter how hardcore you wipe out a city, people have a natural organizing principle, and the next thing you know, their resourcefulness will blow your damn mind at how they get things moving again. So as we move into this time, which, you know, I believe is obvious to whatever extreme it does manifest, how can we be ready? How should we be living our lives?
I think a lot of that is up to an individual thing for everybody. I definitely don't like the idea of throwing one's life into chaos based on something that hasn't happened yet. There's a big difference between preparing and going off the deep end. So it's probably not the time to quit your job, pull your kids out of school, and go live in a shack in the mountains. But physical and mental preparation are pretty important. And an understanding that it's very possible that events are underway to save so many people, it's unbelievable. And so to address those three things quickly, physical prepping, most people can get their heads around pretty quickly. Food, water, seeds. And in this case, we're talking complete pre-industrial time here. So pre-industrial tools, forget, you know, batteries except for the immediate future afterwards. Get a book on natural childbirth. Get a book on crop rotation. Get some maps of local caves. Get some maps of local waterways. Get roadway maps so that if you have to bug out and leave your castle, you know, 3 days walking later, you come across something, you can just pull something out and know where you are and know where you're going. And you need to know if you're bugging out or bugging in. You need to know if you have a bug out location, or you're going to go try to find a cave, if you're going to go try to find a forest away from people. And you can't make those decisions when the disaster happens. Like when it happens, you just need to click into gear immediately and know all of those answers right away. That's the mental side of the prepping. Books, you got to get a ton of books that you might need in the future. You don't need to read and memorize them all now, but you're not going to be able to go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com and pick this thing up when the sun goes nova. It's too late at that point. The other side of this is that just with the underground tunnels and bases we know about, I estimate approximately 90 million Americans could fit inside. There is absolutely no chance I know about all of them. That is...
Of course.
That is literally, 1,000 times what's needed for the military operations and the military personnel that exist across every country in the world. You could still fit 50 million Americans if you put all the militaries in the world down there. And so what don't we know about here and in other countries? And something to consider, while the people on TV and the people who are lobbying Congress and all those people like that, they just give off the most horrible vibe to people in our community. Just we see them as evil puppet masters. They are not the actual powers that be. They're just middle management. What's really happening is the awakening of the people, the push towards the 100th monkey, the push for people to wake up, the push for climate change to be falling, for dark matter to be falling, for the plasma universe and free energy and a real future for our species beyond just the now on this planet is there for the taking, and it's coming. It's a frothy wave you see just on the horizon that you know is going to be an amazing tsunami when it reaches landfall. And this is not happening by accident. We see frauds and liars being exposed worldwide. This is not a picture of powerful elites against us winning and in complete control. This is a complete restructuring of the organization because it needs to happen, or because it just naturally degrades over time to this, what we have now. The people who are really in charge, they believe in karma. Many of them who don't actually have good in their hearts truly believe in the premise that the top of the pyramid on which they currently sit gets higher with the more people there are underneath them. And the number of people who actually believe in this depopulation Georgia Guidestones thing is very, very small. That's not the elites, the real elites. Those are just the elites we see. We don't get to know who's really in charge. We get to yell and point out things that George Soros and the Rothschilds do that are bad. But nobody goes back on the internet to find out that hit the internet like a tsunami. All of a sudden, one day, all of the stuff started popping up about them. The week after, both Soros and the Rothschilds pulled all their money out of oil investing and into alternative energies, wind and solar instead. 1 week later, they're the internet's favorite bad guys. How'd that happen? Who's really pulling the strings on that one? You hear people on the internet saying the same elite, the same 13 elite families have been ruling for this time and that time. And then you hear them mention names like Rothschild and Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a poor kid from Cleveland, and the Rothschilds weren't rich until they made their Napoleonic lie about 400 or 500 years ago. Before that, they were poor too. We have this problem in our community. I found this community and started the channel. I got the channel so I could comment and like and things like that. But it was months before I ever made a video. I never intended to make a video in the first place. I just sort of realized that, hey, there's merit here. There's diamonds in the rough, but it's 99.9% rough. It just so happens I've been classically trained to pull those diamonds out in this exact realm. And I'm doing it for people on a daily basis right now, just in a different field.
Definitely. So you were set up for this mission,
Well, sort of. But what people need to realize is that the elites we get to see are not the elites who are building the tunnels. They're not the elites who built room for every American citizen alive. They're not the same elites who want depopulation and who believe in the Georgia Guidestones. Those are not actually the people in charge. Those are the mouthpieces, the middle management who forgets that they're middle management because they have to play like they're the top of the top for the whole world. And they actually forget sometimes, or they trick themselves into actually thinking it's true. But it's not. And the world and the sun have a wonderful way of rectifying the situation.
Yeah, and that's why this is a very, very difficult time. But who would not feel fortunate to actually be here right now? Because you get to see that purification by the sun. I mean, I would, oh gosh, it's so horrific to say, but I have a feeling of just bring it, let's see it, because the earth is due.
I got to be honest, there's folks who say, there's a couple of folks who claim to know with certainty the year it's going to happen. That's a little much for me. And I don't want it to happen some 20-something years from now when I'm in my 50s or early 60s. I want this to happen right now, if I had a choice. If it's got to happen and it's going to happen and there's no way around it happening, I want it to happen right now. I'm as prepared as I can be. My children are young. And I know a lot of the things I would want to teach them to take into the new world. I am not 18 years old anymore, but through a better awareness of diet and lifestyle, I'm in just about as good a shape as I was in when I was 18 years old. Kind of like my chances. Don't really like the city I'm in terms of chances. I had a much better shot where I was a month and a half ago. But the point is that there's physical preparation, there's mental preparation, things that you won't have time for. And the other part of the mental preparation is if this thing starts to happen and this, these government trucks come through your neighborhood saying we're going to take you to an underground shelter, and you've just got off spaceweathernews.com and you've seen that there's a massive blast coming from the sun, that's not the time to question the government, That's the time to get your family in the truck and go underground, because if they were just trying to trick you and let you die, they'd let you sit there and die. You know, they wouldn't send all these people out there to come bring you underground and then kill you.
It makes sense. And I love the way you mentioned the middle management that forgets their middle management. And if we look through history, even of the last, world wars, there always was the middle management that forgot they were middle management and then got lined up and shot.
Right.
They forgot that they weren't running the show. They thought, oh well, I have a special relationship with the devil, but they didn't. Nope. And it reminds me of Dr. Strangelove, the underground tunnels and underground areas, because if there's some strange human intuition that lets us know of things to come, or some version of them, it sounds like a Dr. Strangelove, but hopefully a much more positive version of Dr. Strangelove. A whole different story, but ultimately, I'm with you. I'm hoping for your version of Dr. Strangelove.
It's positive for some. It's not positive for others. And fortunately, that is finally going to work out the right way. Can you imagine any single person who has committed fraud via email, or any single actor or athlete that has sexually harassed a girl, or who took advantage of a drunk girl at a party in college, who isn't terrified every single day of their lives right now that they're going to be the next ones in the spotlight? Every single person like that right now, who's not a complete idiot, is living hell. They are living out hell every single day and paying for what they did. It's already here. It's already happening. And we've just gotten a tiny little taste of it. But I mean, think about the Italian guy who got arrested for the sex thing, Anthony Weiner, a couple years ago. It's getting worse and worse for them. It's not getting better for them.
For the middle management.
They're going down. They're getting put in the lineup. That's what's happening. And people are very much stuck in this notion that it's us versus the people in power. Well, you just gotta think about the fact that, the grunts down in the warehouse, they don't get a whole lot of invitations up to the CEO's office. But if there is something that is critically crippling the warehouse, the first place the CEO looks is the warehouse manager. Not the people unloading the trucks. It's the warehouse manager. And it's not because out of some structure like rule told him to do it. It's because he knows that's where the problem is. He knows that's where the problem really is. It's not the lazy people. Not everybody in the warehouse is lazy and not doing their job. He knows it's the person he put in charge of all those people so that he didn't have to be there every day doing that. Just put the trust in there. He'll check back on it from time to time. Maybe the check back from the universe on us is every 12,000 years. And it just so happens that we need a management update every 12,000 years. Who knows? There's 1,000 different ways to think about it. And now we are getting into the more speculative side of things. But none of it really changes the fact of what's going to happen, and the fact that you need to prepare physically, mentally for yourself, and you need to prepare yourself mentally to potentially be saved. Because that's not the time to remember your gripe with the government. That's not the time to remember how much you hate the fiat money system. I do too. Are you going to let it keep you out of a bunker to save your life? As plasma and asteroids are raining down all around you, and there's 200-300 mile an hour winds and possibly 1,000-foot tall tsunamis. Not 2 miles high, like Chan Thomas said, but 1,000-foot tsunamis are possible. I mean, I'm not. That's not the moment I'm going to choose to say. If I've just gotten off of the app telling everyone the sun went nova, and I just tweeted it, and I just made a video about it, and then I get a knock on the door, I'm going with my family. I don't care what kind of suit or military outfit is being worn by the person. I'm going to trust that all that evidence I saw, there was something to it, and now's the time to survive. And I hope that people are mature enough to be able to do that and realize that whoever comes and knocks on their door isn't the one they're mad at.
Yeah, don't go out like in the book Les Miserables, I believe. Gosh, and I forget the character names, but you had the guy who stole a loaf of bread early in his life, and the cop that had been chasing him forever. And I guess the guy who stole a loaf of bread could have helped him out of a fire, but he refused it and just died instead. So, yeah, that's a huge, long book on exactly what you're talking about. Don't let your negativity and spite basically let you choose your death rather than life at the hands of those that you perceive as an enemy.
Right. I like that.
Well, my hope through this interview is that we can, and our hope with this series is that we can get more of a Shakespearean, rowdy, scientific brawl going on between people who are talking about, grand solar minimums and then the work of Ben and on the Suspicious Observers Project, because really there's a lot of nonsense out there and a lot of, bickering and such. And really we need a Shakespearean brawl. We need science. We need people to be communicating because, we all tend to hold fast to our beliefs, and we shouldn't, because, intelligence and it's expansive and it's an ongoing process. We should never get stuck in a cult rather than pursuing the truth. And, Grant Hancock, hey, come and join the party. Everybody respects you. Don't be afraid. Get over here.
I was upset that he was the only one who said no to coming on to the Catastrophe Cycle series.
Yeah, we need to get him involved. So I know Radiant Creators is bugging him, and we'll get him on the show. We have a way of wearing people down.
It's especially frustrating because when it's the sun doing it, there are impactors. There is the isotope evidence. There's literally everything you could ask for with an asteroid or a comet, and it's actually guaranteed to happen. Not to mention the fact that if it is just a random asteroid or comet, how is it on a cycle? What, we've got an alien race magically throwing asteroids or comets at us every 12,000 years? The universe doesn't work that way. There is a bit more chaos and randomness to the universe than that, even though there is a phenomenal amount of order. Asteroids and comet strikes don't work that way. You need something that can work on a cycle. And for that, if you have something that can work on a cycle and produce the impactors, you got to start there.
I like where you're coming from. Well, we are just a few minutes under 2 hours. This has been amazing. I thank you so much for being on Radiant Creators. Of course, as most shows end, let people know what you're working on right now and where they can see the material that you're kicking out every day.
By far, the best place to go is Suspicious Observers, the YouTube channel. Everything else basically leads from there, whether you're interested in a book, an app, websites, further video watching, playlist series, everything goes from the hub, which is the Suspicious Observers YouTube channel.
All right, and that wraps it up. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. We've been talking to Ben Davidson from Suspicious Observers, and this is Radiant Creators. Check us out at radiantcreators.com. We're also on Alternate Current Radio. Check that out at alternatecurrentradio.com. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ben. Let's keep the conversation going.
Awesome. That was a lot of fun.
It was great. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Radiant Creators. Check out more content at radiantcreators.com. If you like the show, give it a like. Share this. Comment. Keep the conversation going. You can also find us at alternatecurrentradio.com, where there's this show and a lot more.